My name is Laura Bramante and welcome to my EDU60017 Understanding Theories of Teaching, Learning and Development presentation. So, to begin, learning theories are a set of principles explaining how students or individuals retain and recall knowledge. Three learning theories that have been widely recognised within all levels of educational learning have been behaviourism, cognitivism and constructivism. So now I'll be giving you a brief presentation on one of the key learning theories, behaviourism. Throughout this presentation, I will demonstrate the key characteristics of behaviourism within a classroom setting, the strengths and the limitations of behaviourism on both an academic and procedural level, description of how this theory relates to my own personal values and beliefs regarding effective teaching. Lastly, I will finish off by summarising what I've outlined in this brief presentation. Okay, so let's begin. Now, firstly, what is behaviourism? Well, behaviourism is a theory that was developed in the late 19th and early 20th century by founding fathers John B. Watson and Edward Thorndike. According to Psychology Today, behaviourism can be defined as behaviour or changes in behaviour that are associated between a stimuli and a response. To illustrate this, Thorndike studied this theory by analysing the way in which animals escape from cages. Over many trials, the animals in his experiments needed less and less time to escape. Thorndike made the assumption that getting out of the cage was attractive to the animal, so the experience of getting free reinforced whatever positive behaviour had occurred right before the escape. He called this the law of effect, suggesting that several possible responses which are followed by a satisfying result to the animal will be more likely to occur over and over, whilst those which followed a negative discomfort to the animal will less likely occur again. Watson, on the other hand, focused his studies on children rather than animals. His most famous experiment, conducted in 1920, involved conditioning a 1-year-old infant, known infamously as Little Albert. Watson wanted to condition little Albert to become afraid of rats. By doing so, he presented the infant with a rat while simultaneously playing a painfully loud noise. What Watson was trying to illustrate in his experiment was that behaviourism is very much linked to a cause and effect relationship, whereby an action or event, the painful loud noise, will stimulate a certain response, becoming scared, and as a result will become a learned associated behaviour. Furthermore, behaviourists have referred to these associations as what is called contiguity. It's illustrated in the example with little Albert. In an association of two events that are always closely paired or repeatedly occur at the same time. Psychologist Ian Pavlov began with the notion that there are some things a dog does not need to learn, for example, to salivate when there is food. Pavlov showed the existence of the unconditioned response, the saliva, by presenting a dog with a bowl of food, the unconditioned stimulus, and then measuring its salivary secretions. However, when Pavlov discovered that any object or event which the dogs learnt to associate with food, such as ringing of the bell, would trigger the same response, he realised that this was a result of learning. To further touch on stimulus-controlled theories, we will now briefly touch base on another theory known as operant conditioning, developed by American psychologist B.F. Skinner. According to psychological expert Kendra Cherry, operant conditioning is a method of learning that occurs through rewards and punishment for behaviour. Through operant conditioning, an association is made between a behaviour and a consequence for that behaviour. In Skinner's experiment, for example, a lab rat presses a blue button, he receives a food pellet as a reward. When he presses the red button, he receives a mild electric shock. As a result, he learns to press the blue button but avoid the red button. Now, on to positive and negative reinforcement. So, reinforcers are responses from the environment that increase the probability of a behaviour being repeated. Reinforcers can either be positive or negative. For example, a positive reinforcement is rewarding students with something favourable when they've been good. A negative reinforcement is rewarding a student with something favourable when they haven't necessarily been good. Punishers are responses from the environment that decrease the likelihood of a behaviour being repeated. An example of positive punishment is when a student talks out of turn, the teacher might tell the child off for interrupting them. An example of negative punishment, for example, is when the student from the previous example talks out of turn again and the teacher promptly tells the child that they will have to miss recess or lunch because of that behaviour. So now I'd like to outline some of the strengths of this learning theory. Making particular reference to Tnesny and McMahon, Pavlov's studies of classical conditioning had an impact on research methodology, both in terms of a value placed on precise observation and measurement, and the use of a number of experiments to explore one topic with great precision. As noted by Alberto and Troutman, therapists often use classical conditioning principles to reduce and overcome fearful or irrational behaviour in children and adults. Many irrational fears and phobias are formed as a result of the pairing of a neutral stimuli with stimuli that trigger an involuntary response. Limitations of behaviourism. So, it is largely a one-dimensional approach and limited to explaining those behaviours associated with automatic responses or reflex actions. Sometimes it is difficult to find responses that can provide a starting point for instruction, and it is hard to take into account past experiences. It also does not account for other types of learning, especially learning that occurs with the use of reinforcement or punishment. Now, behaviourism in a classroom setting and my personal beliefs. So when I was in the 5th grade, my primary school teacher came up with a way to reward us for doing good and punishing us for doing bad. She would write in our diary in a blue pen if we did something good. For example, helping out another peer, finishing our homework on time, using appropriate manners, etc. Alternatively, she would write in our diaries with a red pen if we did something bad. If we got 3 blues in a month, then we would receive a reward. If we received 3 reds in a month, then we would receive a punishment. This is a classic example of positive reinforcement and punishment. We must also remember with reinforcing and punishment in a classroom setting to change it up a bit so the student doesn't get bored if they're constantly being rewarded with the same prize or constantly being punished with the same punishment. They may think, this punishment's easy, I've done it a couple of times now, or I've got enough stickers, I don't really need any more. Teachers will always need to incorporate the elements of behaviourism in a classroom. As primary school teachers, the students are in the midst of growing, adapting and learning by example and by trial and error. So, to conclude, behaviourism is a scientifically sound approach to learning as it emphasises on experimental investigations of observable behaviours. Classical conditioning explains why we react to the word through stimulus and response, whereas operant conditioning reminds us that reinforcement is also important in our learning of behaviours. Although behaviourism does indeed show us how we respond to things through association, it should not be the sole learning theory in the classroom. My final slide is just listing a few references that I've used throughout this presentation. Thank you.